wonder why the scene we're shown today seems in a lot of ways so familiar, almost like we've seen it all before. Some of the work I do is in qualitative research, talking to people about their experiences and views, a craft where it's best practice to pay very close attention to your own biases, to be conscious of ways your views and subjectivities may unconsciously influence how you interpret information. Some examples of the different biases that we all tend to experience include hindsight bias, the inclination we all have to see past events as really having been completely predictable all along, or effort justification, otherwise known as the IKEA effect, which is the tendency for people to place disproportionately high value on objects that they partially assemble themselves. And then there is the mere exposure effect, a bias by where just being exposed to something over and over, it becomes more comfortable and we're less shocked by it. With enough mere exposure, something quite out there can start to seem, in fact, not very out there at all. After all, looking at this scene of Palm Sunday today, we know the general gist, right? It's all palm branches and a donkey and a crowd. We pretty much know where it fits in with the story, after Jesus said a lot of things before he gets crucified. And we even know which Sunday we should expect to hear about this story on. So if you also share seeming familiarity at the scene presented in our reading today, I wonder if we all need to check our own mere exposure bias before we delve into it. To be fair, seeming familiarity is not surprising when people have been looking at this passage for such a long time. But maybe that can also help us to uncover what makes the image of Palm Sunday intriguing and important. This Etonian carving was created around the year 900. There we go. I think my favourite part is the t-shirt-like cloaks being trampled along with everything else, squashed in by the artist as they try to contain an uncontainable scene in a 17 by 11 centimetre frame. A messy and expansive happening, somehow condensed into a tiny, holdable, portable 1,100-year-old ivory. Fast forward a millennium to this. In a lot of ways, I prefer this 1976 stained glass window by Marc Chagall. He seems to want to draw our attention to the crowd's faces, rendering them in clear glass so the light can literally shine through, as though to remind us that when the passage says many people spread their cloaks on the road, this wasn't an amalgamated blob of faceless people, but rather a multitude of motivated individuals acknowledging Jesus as Lord. The opposite of mere exposure effect is the bizarreness effect. That is, the tendency of remarkable material to be better remembered than common material. And through the remarkable parts of today's passage that these artists draw our attention to, they leave us with an image that's meant to stick in our minds. A scene both familiar, but at closer inspection, featuring details that should make it stay with us. And so we're left with a sort of contradiction, a both familiar and remarkable scene. Another seeming contradiction is present here. The scene is chaotic. It seems that the crowd are improvising, working with whatever they have, their clothes, their voices, grabbing some nearby tree branches to make a path for the procession. Unlike Leichhardt Church, I don't think they had the foresight to put up a Facebook post asking who had some palm fronds they could bring along to use on Palm Sunday. But they still cobble it together into a somewhat makeshift victorious entry parade. At the same time, Jesus seems to have a completely different approach going on. Could someone just pop around the corner and pick up that donkey I've already got lined up for this one? There's more than one scene in Mark's Gospel where Jesus does a bit of what I like to call a "here's something I prepared earlier" moment. We see something similar in another scene that might seem a bit chaotic: preparations for the Last Supper. A meal that takes place in the looming shadow of a plot to arrest Jesus, a meal where Jesus will throw the party into mayhem with talk of his betrayal. And in that instance, some elements are disconcertingly pre-prepared as well. The disciples are directed to a large room, furnished and ready, that Jesus somehow seems to have organised in advance, perfect for this important event to take place in. Maybe Jesus had some great local connections when it came to finding dinner reservations for 13 people at the last minute. But it's as if the writer of this story is also reminding us of an overarching series of events, not to be disrupted by human disorder and unpreparedness. Moments hinting at overarching organisation in seeming chaos. The contradiction of a story both messy but structured. There's a big sense of expectation in Jesus' entry to Jerusalem. I have, with little exception, always thought of Jesus as entering the city confident and omniscient. As Matthew's Gospel says, seeing a fulfillment of what had been spoken through the prophet. In the know, ahead of his followers, already starting to prepare himself for the series of events leading to his death. But I wonder if, by always starting from this point of view, it causes me to only emphasise the omnipotence and confidence of Jesus over his also very humanness. It doesn't seem like a very human response when among a crowd that is full of optimistic anticipation, and you're the only one that knows how the impending events will evolve, to be feeling overly confident. What seems more human is to be feeling the weight of not being what the crowd around you may expect you to be. The weight of knowing the consequences of the right thing to do next. The weight of knowing how much will have changed in a few days' time. There's definitely something easier about the assumption that Jesus only felt courage and cool-headedness riding into Jerusalem. Easier to confine Jesus' suffering to the scene of the cross, box his suffering into Judas's betrayal and the Garden of Gethsemane. I wonder if this tendency is because it makes us more comfortable to only think of the very extremes of human cruelty and suffering as being able to have any effect on God. It is not to say that Jesus isn't also very much all-knowing and all-seeing, but those times I've interpreted Jesus' character as such to remove some of the most common human sufferings, I'm starting to think misses the point of God become flesh. And again, we are left with a seeming contradiction. Jesus is both all-knowing and all-human. Is this whole passage just full of opposite things at the same time? A scene both familiar but at the same time remarkable, moments that are both chaotic but somehow pre-prepared, and Jesus both omnipotent and human. People often find it difficult to accept scenarios containing things we've been told must be mutually exclusive. We often find it easier to categorise or label people, either by one element of their identity, or by some particular thing they've done, or by one group they're associated with. And I think a lot of us know the difficulty of standing concurrently in spaces that some may label contradiction. A few weeks back, I had the joy of marching in the Sydney Mardi Gras parade with a few of you here and others from this church, alongside people from a range of congregations. A pride parade that in Australia takes its name from a different Easter-associated celebration, Shrove Tuesday. But like Palm Sunday, Sydney Mardi Gras is another joyous parade with an important underlying message. And one of my favourite things about waiting in the parade marshalling area for 4 hours in cold, rainy weather, wearing clingy, fluorescent green lycra, was being among the other parade participants and seeing so many people embracing those parts of themselves that we are often told cannot be true together. Disabled folk getting ready to take the leading position in their floats down Oxford Street. Queer people practicing a drum routine under an affirming church banner. Corporate professionals rehearsing their ridiculous dance moves with glittery pom-poms. Neurodivergent people celebrating their sense of community and uniqueness. fat people enjoying their bodies dressed in strappy, sparkly leather outfits. People from underprivileged and marginalised groups about to be cheered on by the crowd and broadcast on national television. There are not many spaces where these intersectionalities are embraced. Those things that might look, on first inspection, to be contradictions in this passage remind us that Jesus' message is not one that asks us to sort out what others may say are seeming opposite attributes and fit ourselves into a neater mould, but rather invites us into the complex and often difficult work of bridging spaces, resisting easy assumptions, and combating our bias towards categorisation. It's a message that frees you from stereotypes, to be able to say, I am both. I am saved from having to fit into your boxes, able to embrace your own paradoxes and complexities. It's good news. When looking at the scene of Jesus entering Jerusalem on Palm Sunday, it is sometimes positioned that the people in this crowd include some of the same people that will shortly be found in the crowd surrounding Jesus at the crucifixion, calling for his death. And the questions that are sometimes posed to churchgoers on Palm Sunday can be along the lines of, which scene will you be in? Will you be a fickle crowd member, only there at the triumphant entry to Jerusalem? Or will you be a faithful crowd member that follows Jesus all the way to the cross? But I think, as a people saved from being boxed into categories, that also means we can no longer use them to our advantage, to create an us and them, that is, to so temptingly separate or elevate ourselves from others. So again, in this space of contradictions, I would suggest we will probably all, at some point, be both fickle and faithful crowd members, both rejoicing Hosanna and falling asleep in the Garden of Gethsemane. So, as we lead into this coming Easter weekend, I invite you to reflect on what it looks like to both rejoice and humble yourself in Jesus' and your own complexities. Humble yourself and look out for where you have elevated yourselves above others. Leave behind stereotypes and divisions and boxes. Look for ways to bridge space with those who seem at odds with you. Rejoice and give yourself the permission which you have already been given by the Christ we follow, who is both human and divine, to be authentically two seemingly contradictory things. While all the time, in all your contradictions, orienting yourselves towards the cross, where we see Christ's pivotal contradiction of crucified and risen.